Welcome to Brothers of the Word, because, brother, you need the Word. And today I am actually at part number 6 of a 7-part series called The 7 Thorns of Life. And these thorns, they come from when Paul is talking about he has a thorn in his flesh, and he's begged God 3 times to remove the thorn, and God would not remove the thorn. And as God had told me to preach these series on the 7 thorns of life, and George and I were in our morning prayer, and he said, ask George what those 7 thorns are. And George rattled them out: relationships, finance, health, work, faith and spirituality. And today, number 6, the carnal battle of doing what you want to do. The carnal battle of doing what you want to do. You all know that's a battle, and that's a battle and a half. And last week, as I talked about faith, I was just led to read the whole chapter of where there was this battle with faith. And today I want to read the whole chapter. It's the 7th chapter of Romans. I'm going to read the New Living Translation version. But this is a part of where Paul is just struggling with stuff. And see, a lot of people think that just because you are anointed, just because you hear from God, just because you may be a preacher, that you don't have any struggles. Paul wrote most of the New Testament. Most of the doctrine that we follow in the modern Christian church is Pauline. When you study the difference of the varying doctrines throughout Old and New Testament, most of the doctrine that we follow in the modern Christian church is actually Pauline doctrine. So Paul wrote most of the New Testament. His ideas and his influences are so strong, but yet Paul himself was going through all of these struggles. And Paul said, look, nobody followed the law any better than I do. And still he was going through all of these struggles. So here in the 7th chapter of Romans, I want to read this and just listen as Paul talks. And he's talking to the people of that day, but he's talking to us today. Now, dear brothers and sisters, you who are familiar with the law, don't you know that the law applies only while a person is living? For example, when a woman marries, the law binds her to her husband as long as he is alive. But if he dies, the laws of marriage no longer apply to her. So while her husband is alive, she would be committing adultery if she married another man. But if the husband dies, she is free from that law and does not commit adultery when she remarries. So, my dear brothers and sisters, this is the point. You died to the power of the law when you died with Christ. And now you are united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, we can produce a harvest of good deeds for God. When we were controlled by our old nature, sinful desires were at work within us. And the law aroused these evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds, resulting in death. But now we have been released from the law, for we died to it and are no longer captive to its power. Now we can serve God, not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit. Well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would never have known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, you must not covet. But sin used this command to arouse all kinds of covetous desires within me. If there were no law, sin would not have that power. At one time, I lived without understanding the law. But when I learned the command not to covet, for instance, the power of sin came to life, and I died. So I discovered that the law's commands, which were supposed to bring life, brought spiritual death instead. Sin took advantage of those commands and deceived me. It used the commands to kill me. But still, the law itself is holy, and its commands are holy and right and good. But how can that be? Did the law, which is good, cause my death? Of course not. Sin used what was good to bring about my condemnation to death. So we can see how terrible sin really is. It uses God's good commands for its own evil purposes. So the trouble is not with the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble is with me. Let me repeat that. So the trouble is not with the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble is with me. This is the man who wrote most of the New Testament. So the trouble is not with the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble is with me, for I am all too human, a slave to sin. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right. Let me repeat this. This is Paul. I want y'all to, I don't want, that's deep. What is that deep? I'm going to repeat the simple parts. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Does anybody not understand what Paul is saying? This is the man who says he obeys the law better than anyone he knows. This is the man who was so dedicated that he gave his life. This is the man who was sold out to the hilt. This is the man who traveled the snake bit and he just shook it off. This is the man who had all kind of faith. This is the man whose shadow just healed folk. But listen to what he said. Have our shadows healed anybody lately? We just be slapping folk on the head and can't. So this is the man whose shadow healed folk. And he said, I don't really understand myself. For I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, y'all say instead. I do what I hate, but if I know that what I am doing is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I am not the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me. That is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. This is Paul. But if I do what I don't want to do, I am not really the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. I have discovered this principle of life, that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong. I love God's law with all my heart, but there is another power within me that is at war with my mind. This power makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Thank God the answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord. So you see how it is. In my mind, I really want to obey God's law. But because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin. That's the 7th chapter of the book of Romans by the Apostle Paul. And you can see from his words what a struggle Paul had. Now, Paul called it the sin nature in him. But he said he really didn't understand himself. He didn't know what it was. The only thing is, it's like when they asked the blind man, you know, what did he do? What happened? The blind man said, look, I don't know but one thing. Whereas I couldn't see, now I can. That's all I know. Paul said, I don't understand this. He called it the sin within him. The one thing Paul did know, when he wanted to do right, he inevitably found himself doing wrong. This is the struggle that we have between the carnal and the spiritual. Now, I took Spanish a few months ago. It took me a few lessons because I'm going in a couple of months. I'm going to spend a whole lot of time in Spain. So I wanted to really be somewhat fluent in Spanish by the time I got to Spain. What happened was, I took about 5 or 6 lessons. And do you know it's not easy learning another language? But see, I wanted to learn this language. I had set my mind that this is what I was going to do. And I really, in my heart, was going to learn Spanish. And by the time I got to Spain, I was going to be fluent. That's what I really wanted to do. But by the time I got to study, and I had to, and then go through all this stuff and remember all them conjugations and what this means, I said, shoot, I'm just going to use Google Translate. It's what I wanted to do. I really wanted to be fluent in Spanish. But by the time I got through it, I said, I'm just going to use Google Translate. I'm not going to spend all this brain and sweat now trying to learn this language. I'm just going to use Google Translate. So I understand Paul and the struggle he had. Now, one thing I did learn in Spanish is the word for meat. The word for meat in Spanish is carne. It is the same root of carnal. They both come from this Roman, Latin, Greek origin of where we get carnality and carnal and carne. It all means flesh. It all means meat. So the real problem, Paul called it sin, but the real issue is we got problems with our meat. We have problems with our meat, with our flesh. And I don't know what has happened with this flesh. See, all of us are worried about the pandemic, and people are worried about stuff changing DNA. I don't know whether the pandemic is changing DNA. I don't know whether certain drugs out there are changing DNA. I don't know about all that. But I do know something has happened between Adam and Eve in that garden, and when God made us in perfection, something happened to the flesh. Something changed the very DNA. And now we have this nature in us that is a constant battle with the spirit. And how do you wrestle with this carnal? How do you wrestle with when you want to do what you know you ought not to do? And the very thing you ought to do, that's the very thing you don't do. How do you wrestle with that? That thing is a lifelong, it's all throughout history. Paul struggled with it. We struggle with it. So I'm just going to try to deal with just today. You know, how do you deal with that? And see, one of the things about the carnal is you're going to always be in your meat. You can't get rid of your meat. You're stuck with this meat while you're on this plane in this life. You cannot get rid of this meat. This meat got some issues. It's got some feelings to it. It's got some emotions. And when you really look at when people get angry, the meat responds. When people get lustful, the meat responds. When people get hungry, the meat responds. So all of this stuff, your meat has a mind of its own. And it's hard for us to control this meat. I used to be a vegetarian. I no longer am, but James and I, we were vegetarian for about 6 years. We ate, I'm still 80% vegetarian now, but I was strictly vegetarian for a number of years. But somehow now my taste palette is becoming more sensitive, and I can literally taste death in meat. It's hard to explain, but I can taste it. And it's what Paul was talking about within the flesh, because the flesh is dying. There's no question about that. The flesh is dying. We can extend the life. We can do everything as good as we can. The maximum limit of these bodies under ideal conditions, just perfect, no genetic defects, nothing. The maximum limit is about 120. So we could, if we did everything just perfect, we could stretch it to 120, but that's just the limit. The average lifespan right now in the U.S. is about 78 to 80 years old. So this meat, no matter what we do, this meat contains within it the seeds of death. There's just no two ways about it. So we face a constant battle or a constant struggle, and all of us do, with dealing with what the mind knows we should do and what the meat wants to do. So we have a big problem. It's not just mind over matter, it's mind over meat. And you got a big problem with mind over meat, because your meat want to do stuff that your mind know it shouldn't do. And the meat has a mind of its own. It really does. The meat has a mind, and in every area that you should not venture into, the meat has a mind of its own, and your meat will talk to you. So how do you deal with this thing, this battle of the carnal and doing what you want to do versus the spiritual? And it's just like now I can taste death in meat. But even though I can taste death in meat, it don't mean I stop eating it. See, that's the challenge that you go through. My taste buds are becoming, and especially when I first did 42, your taste buds became so alive, you could almost taste the energy of foods. But I still didn't stop eating it. My mind knew. I could taste the death in it. My mind knew. But I still didn't stop. So why is it that our spirit can know one thing, but our meat ends up controlling what we do? This is the battle that Paul faced. And he wrestled with it. And sometimes we may think, well, as I get older, this meat is going to get quieter. And I won't have as much problems out of my meat once I get to a certain age. I don't know what age that is. Because your meat is still going to talk to you no matter how old you are. Some of your emotions, some of the cravings of the youth may die down just a little bit, but that meat still, it'll be something else pop up. Many of the people who used to go out and just get high all over, they don't do that once they get old. And it's not they don't do it because they don't want to do it. The body just can't handle it anymore. Some of the men who used to run around got women everywhere. Once they hit about 70, 80, they cut all that out. It ain't because the meat ain't working. That's the only reason. If the meat was working, they'd be out there doing the same thing they did at 20. It just ain't working anymore. That's the only reason why. So sometimes it's not that they have gotten so matured and they have gotten so elevated and so spiritual, the meat just died. So that's the real reason for a lot of this stuff. So what do you do when your meat not dead? When your meat is still alive and you're dealing with all of these temptations and all of this stuff. And it's just the world, all of the world is geared to speak to your meat. It's not geared to speak to your spirit. When you drive out of this church and you're going to see all these billboards. And every one of the billboards is designed to speak to your meat. None of them are designed to speak to your spirit. They're all designed to appeal to the lower fleshly carnal nature. So how do we deal with this thing? What do we do? Because this thing is with us all of the time. How do we handle carnality versus spirit? Let me tell you one thing you can easily tell when something is carnal and when something is spiritual. The carnal always leads you to death. The spiritual will always lead you to life. That's true even on a simple material level thing. Carnal takes you to death, and spiritual takes you to life. And that's all. If you're faced with any decision over anything, ask yourself over the long haul, for the men who are married, and you see this pretty woman, and your meat responds. Not your mind, your meat. Sometimes it ain't your mind, your meat just responds. It just does. The hormones change, and your meat just responds. So what happens when you see this pretty woman and your meat just responds? You have to ask yourself, is this going to take me to life, or is this going to take me to death? Will this bring life into my relationship, or will this bring death into my relationship? Now the thing about meat and the carnality, meat and carnality is quick. Spirit is slow. You get instant gratification fooling with this meat. You just do. You get instant gratification. It just feels good right now. Now, a year from now, you got some issues to deal with because they felt good a year ago. But now you got issues, and now you have death that is set in certain areas of your life. But meat feels good for the moment. Spirit will take you through eternity. And that's the difference. So one of the things that you can easily tell whether something is carnal or spiritual is just ask yourself, is this thing leading me to life, or is this thing leading me to death? And see, the things of the carnal, they don't cause death right away. It takes some time. And a lot of times the things that we struggle with, they're the things that we go back to. It's why people who have been addicted to something and it's gotten into their meat and they're addicted to this stuff, and they beat the addiction and they come off it and then they relapse. Almost every time you check the relapse is they've gotten in a low point of life. And when this pressure is hitting, they've gotten in this low point, they go back and grab what they knew from the past that used to satisfy them. And that's how they relapse, because the carnal is just always there. So if the carnal is always there, you've got to make sure you never leave the spiritual. And it's a struggle, and it is a battle, and it is something that all of us face. I want to give you 3 quick keys just to help you fight the carnal. Partner, placement, and pattern. Partner, placement, and pattern. And I've talked about this before. If you have a partner with anything, now you can have a partner in crime. You need to have a partner in spirit, not a partner in meat. You need a partner in spirit. So if you have a partner in spirit, I am talking about a human partner, because who you hang with depends where you go. So if you're hanging with somebody that's going down a path that's death, it pulls you down that path. Every time if I hang with C. Elijah or James, I don't have to worry about which direction I'm going into. C. Elijah just changes the way I talk even. Because you can't get him to say anything negative about anybody. Because when you start speaking negative, it is death. It's death to you, it's death to the other person. You can't I'm going to tell you, if you ever hear C. Elijah talking real bad about somebody, you need to put them in the electric chair right away. So partner makes a difference. And that's why really Paul said the only real thing that can keep me is to partner with Jesus. So if you partner with Jesus, if he's gotten inside of your meat, and that's why you have to crucify this flesh, because this flesh is tough. It's tough, and you have to not only crucify, you got to crucify it every day. Because if you kill it today, it's back up tomorrow waiting on you. It just is. So partner, in the natural, make sure you hang around with somebody who's going in the direction where you want to go, that's away from the carnal, that's away from death, and that is toward life. And make sure you have made Jesus your partner in your life. So partner, placement. Placement is just where you are and what you are right. Let me give you just a good example of something I dealt with in my house recently. I came in the house and I asked my wife, I said, sweetheart, I said, look, can you please move these chocolate chip cookies? She had 2 bags of chocolate chip cookies sitting right there in the middle of the kitchen. One was a green bag, one was a white bag, and had these big old chocolate chips on the front. And after about a week, I didn't touch the chips, but every time I went by, they were hollering to my meat. Every time I went by, they were hollering to my meat. So I said, sweetheart, can you please not put these cookies in the middle right here where I can see them? And she said, look, so you see all this fruit I got around here? I got all this fruit. I got all this wholesome stuff, and you around here fussing about 2 little bags of chocolate chips. I got all these bananas, all these oranges, all these apples, all these grapes. I got all these strawberries. I got blueberries. I got blackberries. I got all this fruit. And you fussing about 2 bags of cookies. I said, sweetheart, you don't understand. None of the fruit is calling to my meat. Fruit is quiet. I walk in the apples, ain't said a word. Bananas ain't said a word. But the very thing that I know I should not have, I said, sweetheart, just put them up in the cabinet so at least I can't see them. And she was just as obedient, so now they're up in the cabinet. I had to look in there this morning to see what color the bags were so I could tell you all the truth about what color the bags were, because I thought they were green and red, but they're actually green and white. Placement makes a difference. And I held up for 7 days against those cookies, but I could feel it. I was getting weaker every day. So if you have stuff around you that is taking you to death, get it out from around you. Partner, placement, and pattern. Pattern makes a huge difference. Anything you're trying to do, if you get in the habit of doing that thing, and it takes about 90 days, depending upon what it is, it varies depending upon what it takes about 90 days to form a habit. So if you get in the habit, and no matter what it is you're trying to do, good or bad, if you get in the habit of it, if you develop the pattern of it, it starts to literally create grooves in the brain. This is actually neuroscience that they track. When people get into habits, it literally burns a road in your brain. And it can burn that road whether it is good or bad. So whatever it is you need to do, start it and stick with it for at least 90 days. Get in the habit of the thing. And the pattern will help you to overcome it. If you get up at 5 a.m. to pray and you keep doing that, there's something about it, the pattern will get you up. If you start exercising 3 days a week and you do it on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the pattern will get you in the gym. So if you do the pattern, if you start eating 5 servings of fruit and vegetables every day, the pattern will keep you on the right path, and it makes it a lot easier. The struggle that we face with the carnal of doing what we want to do is an age-old and difficult and challenging struggle for all of us. Just as it was with Paul, so it is with us. Partner with somebody in the natural and Jesus. Placement. The stuff that you should not have, that you should not be around, get it out of your world. And finally, develop the pattern of doing what you know you should do. This is part 6 of the 7 Thorns of Life. You can go to brothersoftheword.com and listen to the entire series absolutely free of charge, or send it to a friend free of charge. We all have thorns, but God has given us the mechanism to deal with the thorns and become better with our thorns than we are without them. Thank you for joining us today at Brothers of the Word, because, brother, you need the Word. Brothers.